welcome back. Today I've got my next list review to go over with everyone. This list I ran in my buddy Jamie's casual event that he ran this fall. It was supposed to be a 3-game tournament. It was supposed to be new player friendly. He didn't really want people to bring stuff that really hit hard or hurt feelings or things like that, and wanted us to have fun bringing new things and trying new things out, or just bringing stuff that you might not normally see. So what I decided to do was run my pirates, and I wanted to build a list that was themed around light mechs or light mech spam. One of the reasons I went with that theme is because, you're reading a lot of lore and you've seen a lot of books and a lot of the source material that, light mechs, some of these soldier mechs, things like that, they take up the bulk of most of the armed forces. You got a lot of things like stingers and wasps and spiders and things like that, right? And in competitive play, you might see some of the really high-end, fast light mechs coming into play quite a bit, especially if they're TMM4. But it starts to drop off at TMM3 just because they have a tendency to die very quickly. They don't have a lot of hit points. And definitely the TMM2 light mechs, really, you don't see them hardly at all. So I wanted to see if I could make that work in a list. And I thought that this casual event would be a good opportunity to try to put that list together and play that in a tournament format that was more casual. I mean, it's still competitive, but the focus of the event was just to have fun and not to really go hard. So I kind of decided I would use this event as my opportunity to try this out. And I played a couple times beforehand, trying some lists out on Wednesday nights and when guys came over to the house and stuff like that. But this was my opportunity to see if it could really compete and complete missions. The other thing I wanted to do was try to focus on bug mechs. So when we go through the list, you'll see that the vast majority of the units in this list, I think 10 of the 13 units in this list, are all bug themed, right? They have some sort of bug tie-in of some sort. So we're going to hop into the list. I kind of got this broken down into a couple sections. We're going to go over the rationale behind the different units and why they're in the list. And I've got them grouped together, and then we'll go and break the individual units down. So my first kind of block of units that I have here, which I would consider my part of my core. When we go and break down to the 250, we'll really see what the real core ends up being. But kind of the block core of my bug list is made up of a flea 17, a spider SDR 5V, a cicada CDA 2A, a locust LCT 3V, a locust LCT 1V. And those are what I consider to be my fast bug mechs, right? They're all speed 16, TMM3. They got 4 or 5 points of armor and structure between those. And then usually they're dishing out 1 at medium and 2 at short range. Sometimes it's not as good. The spider also has jump. The next is kind of like my not so fast bug mechs, and that's 2 stingers, a 3G and a 3R, and a wasp 1A. So right there, you see I've got this core group of bug mechs. Now I've got some fast ones, and I've got some not so fast ones. Now with the not so fast ones, the 2 stingers and the wasp, the one thing I did want to make sure that those had, because their TMM is lower and their movement isn't as good, I made sure that those mechs all had jump. So they also all are able to jump. I added in a yellow jacket, and it's a VTOL. It's the ammo version of it. So I saved a little bit of points there because he has less health. But what I like about him is he's 222. And my idea here with him being in the list is that he's going to be kind of long range sniping, right? Whereas the bulk of the bug mech list, the 2 groups I went over before, they're going to be running around in the middle, swarming the enemy, right? That's the idea there, is that they're going to be swarming the enemy and giving them too many targets to shoot at. And then because of their speed, they're going to be getting a lot of rear shots. They're going to be able to dominate boards and take advantage of mistakes, things like that. Now, the downside, of course, is all this stuff is very, very weak. And you'll see that when we break the lists out. This as a light mech build, and if you do a light mech build, you're going to find really quickly that your damage output and your HP are not where you want them to be. But because of your speed, you can actually be pretty defensive, and you can take full advantage um, of getting rear shots and getting around opponents and ganging up on them. Like that's kind of how you want to play this list, and you'll see that as we go through and break things down. So because everything in this list so far is not the best, right? When it comes to damage output, I wanted to have something in there that could really close the deal. Something that could really beat up on the enemy in each of my sub lists. And so I selected 3 units to put into this army that I'll pull into my 250 lists, and they're actually going to be doing the bulk of the damage, and they're going to be the ones that are chipping away. So the first is a heavy LRM carrier. Now I know this is not bug themed because it's a heavy LRM carrier, but I needed something that could really take a chunk out of someone. And I selected this because it gives me indirect fire. My actual plan in this list is to have the stingers and the wasps, because they're jumping and they have the least amount of points, is they're the ones who are going to be spotting for that heavy LRM carrier. And then I can also park and hide this heavy LRM carrier to give it a little more longevity. But he's going to be going stationary and dropping IF5 on my opponent every turn. Then I have a grasshopper, which is really kind of a pointed down. You'll see why here in a second. A pointed down kind of brawler / skirmisher who can get into the middle. He's got 13 points of damage. He's 3-4-1. So he's got a good medium range damage of 4. He also has jump, so he can get his defense up a little bit. He's got a little more weight, and he's going to be dishing out damage in some of my lists at that medium range of 4. But the big dog in this is going to be an Atlas 7D, the AS7D Atlas. Now, his role is really to take hits, be a distraction, and to ground and pound the enemy's big units. Ideally, the way that you win with this list is by having that heavy LRM carrier and that Atlas focus firing on units every turn. They should be hitting the same thing, which should be relatively easy because the Atlas just has to have line of sight. And then one of the other mechs in your list, one of the other bug mechs, hopefully it's a Stinger or a Wasp, but those other bug mechs should be eyes and ears for the heavy LRM carrier and drop, so he can drop those missiles. So the Atlas 7D, he's 5.52, so he doesn't have a long range attack. He's got that mid range attack, and so you're really trying to. You're very slow. You only move 6. He's got a ton of hit points though, which really benefits him. And he's going to be wanting to move up slowly and engaging with the enemy. Now, the one thing I did have to do in this list, because bug mechs and light mechs are so cheap, is you have to skill down a lot of guys, which kind of benefits you in some ways. Your hits, while not throwing as many dice, your hits are going to connect more. So what I did with this Atlas is I made him a skill 2 Atlas. So those medium range attacks of 5 should be connecting almost all the time, right? Especially, with his TMM only being 1 and his armor structure being so high, I would not be afraid to just stand him stationary and blast away. The Grasshopper is a 3-4-1. He's got a jump, and I made him skill 3 as well. You'll see in this list as we go, a lot of the jump units, what I did is I skilled them down to skill 3 to make up for the fact that they'll be jumping. So when they're jumping, because they're skill 3, they're really only going to be a pilot skill of 5 on the dice. So they're not nearly as effective, and that kind of makes up for the fact that they're jumping around the board. And it kind of encourages me to want to use that jump ability to get their TM up a little more. So I made him skill 3. The LRM carrier, again, he's got that indirect fire of 5. He also has a turret that also has an indirect fire of 5, which is great. So if guys are trying to sneak around your back, you still have the ability to use the turret to confront them. And I made him a skill 2. So he should be deploying on the board behind a hill and basically going stationary for the rest of the game to make his skill 1, which is pretty awesome. The Flea 17, I made him a skill 3. And the reason I did that is because he's got a medium range shot of 2. So I wanted to make sure that he was connecting and had a better chance of connecting on that medium range shot. The Spider, the 5V, I really like this Spider. He's got 5 total hit points, but he's only 1-1. I did make him a skill 3 because he's got that jump, and that's going to help him as he's jumping to be able to peg a single hit every turn and get those hits in there. And especially if you can get into the rear of an opponent, that's really going to help. If he doesn't need to jump and he can run behind someone and he's skill 3, plus he's getting that extra attack, it's going to be helpful for him. The cicada, he's only a 2/1, but he does have energy weapons. I should note that both the flea and the spider also have energy weapons, and the grasshopper, which makes them, crit resistance, which I really, really like. And it's something that we all should really like. Made the cicada, though, a skill 4. He's speed 16, so he's going to be running around the board, trying to get into close range, but avoiding the target's front arc as much as possible, because only having 4 or 5, 3 hit points on a lot of this stuff makes him really, really fragile. The yellow jacket, 2/2/2. I also made him, for his damage profile, I made him a skill 3, because he's going to be flying around. The goal with him, because his TMM is only 2, he's only moved 12, is to fly around in the backfield and then use that skill 3 to take those long range shots. And hopefully you're also spamming the middle with all this other light stuff so heavily that your opponent is not wanting to shoot at the VTOL, because he's TMM2, he gets the VTOL bonus of 3. And then you can just pluck an extra 2 points in there where it's needed. He can chip away, he can crit seek. That's the other thing this list is really good at. If you can strip someone's armor away because you have a ton of stuff that's shooting 1, you can drop crit, 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 crit. I found that on units. So if they've got some bigger things, if they're running some bigger units that got 10, 12, 14, 16 hit points, you can strip that armor off. Having all these little guys with 1 shot can really stack the crits real quick. The 2 locusts, so the 1V and the 3V, they're basically the same with the exception of the 3V, which has a short range attack of 2. Otherwise, they don't have energy weapons, they don't have case, they're a little more vulnerable, so we're going to use that speed to kind of get away from the enemy, to flank, to get around in the back, to take advantage of the opponent, and really to grab objectives where you can. The 2 stingers, the 3G has energy weapons. I made him skill 3 because he's got the jump and I want him to be jumping, whereas the 3R does not have energy weapons, but he does have a skill 3 that I've added here. He's also got that jump because I want him to be jumping. I want him to be getting that TMM up, just like with the other stinger. And then the last is the wasp, which is basically a carbon copy of the 3R as far as stats goes. I made him a skill 3 because he's got that jump. And then one other unit I've thrown in here is a skimmer for good measure, and made him skill 5 to make the points work. It's got 1 hit point, moves 26, TMM of 4. Everyone knows them, everyone loves them and hates them simultaneously, but they are what they are, right? Maybe Wolfnet bans them, maybe they don't, but until they do, he's going to be in this list that I run, and certainly in this event, I ran him in the list. I'm going to take a real quick break, and we're going to come back, and I'm going to break this list down into its 250 component lists, and we'll take a look at kind of the thought behind why I would do that, how I would do that, some other options that might be out there, and we'll look at some substitutions and some other issues that I found when building this list that I kind of want to review with you guys that you need to consider if you want to run a light mech kind of spam list, bug mech spam list, and the things that you have to kind of worry about and think of, because you're not going to necessarily be hitting those benchmarks that we like when it comes to building a list, right? You're going to be faster, you're going to have a higher TMM average, but you're not going to have the hit points. You're not going to have the damage output. So what are the ways when we build these lists? What are the things that we need to consider when we're building these 250 sub lists? So we'll take a quick break and I'll be right back. All right. So as you can see here, I've plugged my 350 point list into my Excel spreadsheet. At the top, I've got the number of units and the total points. This is just so I can make sure that I'm verifying my formatting and my cells right for the formulas that I put in there, and it acts as a check on my totals to make sure things are working. I like to put that in there. At the top, I've got my name of my unit, relevant stats, and then I've got the units listed with all their abilities. So I've got their TMM, their skill, their move, their armor, their structure, their size, their short, medium, long range damage, any points that they're costing me, and then their special abilities. So at a glance, I can see all the relevant Alpha Strike stuff. Then in the last column, I put in their usage. So how many times is this unit showing up in my sub 250 lists? And from there, identified my core units as the ones who basically show up 7 or 8 times, right? And then my secondary units are the ones that are showing up more than half the time. And then anything less than that, I like to highlight and go, well, what's going on here? Why aren't they showing up? And as I go through my lists, I can see why they're being underutilized or not utilized at all. So the 3 that stand out are the Stinger 3R, the Wasp, and then the Yellow Jacket, which isn't being used at all. And honestly, as I started putting together my 250s, I just never found a spot that I liked the Yellow Jacket to be in. I never got to a point where I was like, hey, you know what? I'd rather have the Yellow Jacket over a Locust, or the Yellow Jacket over the Flea, or the Yellow Jacket over the Spider, right? And part of it is those VTOLs are a lot more fragile when it comes to getting motive hits, and they also have a lot harder time holding objectives. And this one in particular, because it's TMM, is only 2, up to 3 because it's a VTOL, but it's only a 2. It makes it really hard to kind of lean onto it because it only gets 3 damage and then it's toast, right? And so you get to be a little more worried. Now, if I was to use this and plug it in, I'm going to use it as a long range sniper, right? I don't want to be at medium range. I don't want to be hit because I'm just going to fall out of the sky. So I have it at 0 right now. And maybe if I'm building this list and I'm finding holes in the list, I can come back to it and say, well, I've got 22 points sitting right here that I can swap out and swap something else in, right? I can also look at that Stinger and Wasp and say the same thing. Like, well, what are they doing here? And do they need to be in the list? Maybe they do. I mean, sometimes you only take a unit for one sub 250 list, right? That's perfectly valid. But if they're not, right, and these units are basically the same, so they're pulling double duty, right? They're just carbon copies of each other. And if there's not a real reason to be there and you need some other unit, or you need to plug a hole somewhere on a specific mission, I've already identified 3 units that are candidates to be swapped out of this list. And going through this exercise, what's important to remember is that if you were to just show up with your 350 point list and build your 250s on the fly, or just chicken scratch them really quick, and not know this information, you might not know that there's units being underutilized. So your list isn't as tight. And when your list isn't as tight, you don't have all the available possible tools for each submission. So by going through this exercise and identifying what's going to be in your list and what the usage is, you can see where you have units that can be swapped out for something else that aren't being used, right? So I've got those candidates. I've also noted on here that the Grasshopper is only being used 4 times. And maybe I swap that out for a second LRM carrier. That's going to get me another point of damage. It's going to give me some indirect fire, so things can't hide from it. It's not going to be able to get on objectives. It's not going to be able to move around like the Grasshopper. But I could potentially add that second LRM carrier. So I've made a note that maybe that's something that I want to try in this list. Ultimately, I didn't do that, and the reason I didn't do that was because the tournament that we played, where I brought this list, was supposed to be kind of a casual, friendly tournament. I just thought bringing 5 indirect fire would be kind of not cool, right? So I didn't go with that. And ultimately, this list lacks body and lacks size. And I really needed that Grasshopper, especially on King of the Hill, but in a couple other missions as you see it, where I added it. I think it ultimately ended up being the better choice. The last thing I added was that Wolfnet might bad the skimmer. And so it's something to note. I built this list long ago, but I'll pick it up and bring it to my club nights or pickup games with buddies. I would consider running it in a more competitive tournament to see how it did. But I've made a note here that Wolfnet might be banning skimmers. And so that's something that you want to be aware of for future list writing, that if this unit goes away, what are you going to do with those points? Maybe you don't do nothing because the list is fine as it is, but maybe you have to swap stuff out. Maybe you have units in the list that can pick up a skill be with those 6 points, but maybe your list is so tight that if you upskill, say my Cicada from a 4 to a 3, then suddenly I have to rework a bunch of my 250s, right? Because the 250 lists are already at that 248, 249, 250 kind of point. You see I've got my averages at the bottom. You'll note that the TMM looks a little low for being such a fast list, but that's because I've got a couple of units that are pretty slow. I've got a heavy alarm carrier. I've got the Grasshopper, the Yellow Jacket, and the Atlas that are dragging that down. But ultimately, it's got a total of 29 TMM across everything, which I think is pretty good. The skill is pushing 3. It's pretty low, and that's for good reason. This is supposed to be a swarm list of light mechs, and so I had to take the skill and really drive it down in order to fill up points, right? And so hopefully what that's going to give me, because you can see here my mid-range damage is only 25 total points across the whole 350, whereas normally I like to try to shoot between 20 and 25, right? For my 250s, this is going to only field 25 points. So I'm not even going to come close to that 20 or 25 most of the time, but maybe I'm going to get some better quality shots because I've got a better skill, right? But if I built this list and I saw, oh, I'm only doing 25 points of damage at medium, but my skill is up around 4, that might be a cause for concern, right? Then I'm going to look at my totals. I got my total HP. It's only 75. We already know because it's a light mech list. It's a swarm list. It's already not going to be throwing a lot of weight around, and you'll see that as well as we go through the list. Now, when I look at my specials, the things that pop out is I don't have flak, so I'm going to be vulnerable to VTOLs, which, may or may not be a bad thing. If I run into a VTOL heavy list, I might have trouble shooting it down. But again, I'm kind of compensating for that by having these skilled down units, right? I'm going to it's not going to be as good as flak, but I have enough skilled down units that I'm going to be connecting with shots against VTOLs. And then really with VTOLs, you're trying to get those motive hits, right? To try to get them to cripple and fall out of the sky and slow down. The other thing is I don't have ECM, and I opted in this because it was a friendly list. I knew that really no one was going to try C3. It's clan invasion, so it's not a huge risk, but I didn't include it, and you'll notice that as well. You see I have a good spread of energy weapons. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units with energy weapons. And a lot of those units are units that I'm going to be using quite a bit, right? The cicada, the flea, the spider, the stinger. And then a bunch of them have jump as well. So I've got a good spread of that jump also. So we're going to get into our list itself. We're going to start with stand-up fight. So you'll see here, I've got the number of units in there. I've opted to go a little heavier on stand-up fight because I want to be able to dish damage a little more reliably and really throw it out there. And even then, I'm only getting up to 19, which is the bare minimum, or not even the bare minimum that I want to see. And the HP is only 54, right? So this is not a particularly heavy list or shooty list, but it does have good quality shots, right? The Grasshopper, the Atlas, and the Heavy LRM are all at skill 3 or 2. That Heavy LRM is going to be able to hide, and it's going to be able to very consistently drop 4 damage or turn on a unit. And if the Atlas can connect with it as well, really what you're doing in Headhunter here between those 3 units is focusing and just dropping the biggest threats every single turn, while the Cicada, the Flea, and the 2 Locusts are running around. They're getting rear shots, they're dodging, they're pulling, they're distracting your opponent, things like that. So that's how I would run this list and stand up and fight. Now, I am short points. I'm only at 246. That's 4 points short of a 250, which might be fine. I've noted in here that maybe this would be a spot where I want to put that yellow jacket in. So I've made a note off to the side, and in real time in a game, I can make the decision. You know what? I want some long range sniping. I want to be able to pink 2 shots at long range onto a unit, especially in stand-up and fight. So maybe instead of having a runner unit like that Locust 1V, I'm going to swap that yellow jacket in. So I've made a note that maybe the yellow jacket would fit in here. Hold the line and overrun lists are the same as is my Headhunter list, I believe. So those ones are the Atlas, the Heavy LRM carrier, the Cicada, the Flea, the Locust, the Skimmer, another Locust, a Spider, and a Stinger. Now, in this list, I'm all the way down to 17 points of damage. Now, again, I'm leaning on high quality shots from that LRM carrier and the Atlas to do the bulk of my damage here and hold the line, while I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 other units that are going to be out there grabbing objectives, running around, trying to outflank the enemy and trying to catch them off guard so that I can get into and get those objectives and score those points for myself, right? Same thing, same concept's going to happen in Overrun. right? Where I have lots of units that can run around, they can hide. I'm even going to build the terrain in such a way, or try to build the terrain in such a way that I can hide behind it and try to survive, while my Atlas and my LRM carriers are taking his units out, or taking my opponent's units out, right? Now, again, you'll see here that both these lists go up to 250. They're all the way down to 51 hit points. So I'm really going to rely on my speed and being very cagey with how I expose my units, um, so that I'm not taking hits. But I've identified the Yellow Jacket as a potential candidate that could jump in there. But it would replace the Locust and the Skimmer. Now, I don't know that I would do that in these lists. This is really a way to identify, how could I get the Yellow Jacket in there, or is it worth it? I don't think in these lists it is, because I'd rather have stuff on the ground, especially that Skimmer, that can catch someone off guard, suddenly get into a zone, or jump on an objective, right? And that Locust is the same way. That Locust, his real strength is the ability to sprint, to get into a spot that your opponent doesn't have guarded, or who is left exposed, especially if you run up against someone who wants to bring a lot of heavy and assault mechs. And then he's also going to try to get rear shots on guys, right? So again, with a light list, you want to be really cagey, you want to be really maneuverable, pick your battles, pick your shots, focus fire, trying to minimize the amount of shots that are coming in on you. But these two lists, the missions run kind of similar. I mean, not totally similar, because one, you're trying to get on objective points in your opponent's backfield. The others, you're trying to hold territory across the board. But in both these missions, you want highly mobile units that can take advantage of your opponent as they become more thin and as they lose control of the board. And so I'm probably going to not take the Yellow Jacket, and I'm going to lean into that having lots of guys on the board. Now, I'm primarily going to use the Stinger. He's going to be jumping around and not really putting out any quality shots, because he's jumping and he's every turn. But he's going to be the eyes and ears for that LRM carrier. And then my other units will be the eyes and ears for the LRM carrier if, for whatever reason, the Stinger gets out of place. You can use the Skimmer as eyes and ears. I like doing that. The Skimmer makes a really good spotter unit. Now, the only problem is they don't really have much in the way of health, and it only takes like one hit to kill them. So keep that in mind, that you might inadvertently throw your Skimmer away when you don't want to throw it away, just to get a shot off with the LRM carrier. So I don't, unless I'm really leaning into the Skimmer being my spotter, I wouldn't try to use him that way. You really want to use him to catch an opponent off guard when they fail to protect their objective. Now, when we come down to Headhunter, we've got the Atlas, we've got the LRM carrier, we've got the Skater, the Flea, the Locust, the Spider, and the Stinger. It's the same list again, right? What I like about it in Headhunter is that you can use the Skimmer as one of your commanders, which is kind of dicey, to be honest, right? Like, if you were to use the Skimmer as one of your commanders and he gets caught, that's it. He's done, right? Someone closes with them. They got fast stuff. They got stuff with good quality shots. So you really have to be cagey. But what I like is you can take that Skimmer and bait, right? So you can be like, hey, my objective is over here in this corner, and it pulls the opponent towards him. And then he can be like, psych, now I'm in the other side of the board. Now I'm over here. So when you use something like a Skimmer and Headhunter, while you're taking a big risk, there's a lot of opportunities to bait and pull your opponent off out of position, really is what it is. And then he's chasing a ghost, essentially. And then the Skimmer can just totally relocate, right? And be gone the next second. So that would be one of my potential candidates for my commander. The other two in my mind is going to be the heavy LRM carrier, because he's going to want to hide anyways and be stuck in the back anyways. And that's going to force your opponent to have to draw into him. And when they're drawing into you across the battlefield and into your backfield to go after that heavy LRM carrier, you're going to use all your fast stuff to kind of envelop them and surround them and pick them off. And you're also going to bring them in towards your Atlas, who you want to be shooting at as close a range as possible anyways with that skill 2, and he's just going to be reliably putting out 5 hits every single turn. The last thing on the list that I would consider or not the last thing. You can consider any one of these units. But the other unit I'd consider as a commander would be the Atlas, just because he can take so much damage. And if you have him at long range, sitting behind a hill, even with a team in ones kind of skirting back and forth, like it's a lot of meat to chew through. And if your opponent is shooting at the Atlas and trying to take out those 5 shots, it's going to take him several turns to do it, which means he's not shooting at your light stuff. He's not going after your LRM carrier. So that would be the other option here in Headhunter. Again, I identify the Locust and the Skimmer as a potential drop candidate for the Yellow Jacket. Now, in this list, that might be something you would want to consider, just because you get those reliable long range sniping shots off of that Yellow Jacket. Might be something that's beneficial. Again, I probably would lean against it myself because I really like running the Skimmer and the Locust in this mission. It does very well, and then you can always swap out for that Yellow Jacket if you felt that it was necessary, but it probably wouldn't bring it in. Domination. So in Domination, I've got 9 units here. It's the same list again. So you know how we talked about in the last list, and I've talked about this in my how-to list, oftentimes you don't actually have to build several lists, like 8 full lists. You really have to build 5 lists. So here's another example, except instead of it being stand-up fight and Headhunter and Domination, Overrun and Hold the Line, we've moved it on to Domination instead. And the reason I have it in Domination is because Domination is a very fast mission. You want to have a lot of speed or good quality speed in that. And I just found time and time again when I was building this and when I played games that having that Atlas and the heavy LRM carrier anchoring your back 2 objectives and covering that while everything else kind of flies around and grabs the other 3 objectives works super, super well. That mission is an objective grab mission. And if you can take that heavy LRM carrier and that Atlas and say, you know what, he's coming forward, my opponent's coming forward, and he's left one guy on each of the back objectives. Well, guess what? I'm going to use my Atlas and my heavy LRM carrier to delete them this turn. And then I'm going to send this swarm of light bug mechs over there to finish him off if he hasn't been deleted and to grab that objective before my opponent can react and get back there, right? So I really liked how this 250 build worked in Domination. I've had a lot of really good success with it. Again, I identified the Yellow Jacket as being able to come into this list. Honestly, I wouldn't take it. I think your Skimmers are just super good in Domination. So I probably wouldn't swap it out. Now, if Skimmers get banned and I can't run that 6-point Skimmer in this list, that Yellow Jacket might become an option just to get to my 250, because I'm going to be leaving 6 points on the table. And it's okay to leave 2, 3, 4, 5 points sometimes, but 6, 7, 8 starts really pushing it. And so that's something to consider, is trying to find an alternative. Ideally you find something that's small, that can hide, that's very fast, that's kind of in that same point realm. But for 6 points, 6 points is going to be really hard. You'll be really hard pressed to find something that replaces that Skimmer. So maybe the move is for you, if that gets banned, is to replace the Locust and the Skimmer with something that equals 24 points that does a little more than what the Locust is doing, right? So capture the flag. What I've done in my capture the flag list is I've gone all speed. So when you look at this, you'll see that the Atlas, this is the one list the Atlas is not in. This list is ripping fast. It just moves. Now, it doesn't have that high end, 18, 20, 22, 24 speed, but everything that has any sort of movement in here, in this list is in there. So I've got the Cicada, the Flea, the 2 Locusts, the Spider. I even noticed that I forgot to make the Spiders move 16, which is going to change this number even more. Then this is the list where I'm actually running the Wasps and the Stingers, right? This is the one where the 3R and the 1A show up, and this is the only list they show up in. And I like them because they're actually not going to go for the objectives. They're going to go for my opponent's base, and they're going to act as a spotter for that LRM carrier in the event that the opponent that I'm facing gets a flag and is running to the back of their base. Because chances are that unit that grabs that flag is something that's very light and very fast. And as long as I can see it with a spotter or with the LRM carrier, I can drop skill 2, 5 indirect fire on that thing, and probably get them to drop the flag, right? I can probably kill them outright and then chase them down. So when I'm playing this mission, that wasp and those 2 stingers are bypassing the center objectives, and they're trying to go towards my opponent's rear. And if necessary, they're even going to try to get on the opponent's base to prevent them from scoring, right? While everything else is trying to cap objectives. The grasshopper is going to move into the mid board, and he's going to cover the 2 objectives and cover my units as they run back and forth and put out quality shots and dump those into them. So this list maxes out at 10 possible units. Its whole goal is to try to get objectives, get them back as quickly as possible, and then to run down my opponents as they try to score as well. So it's got 250 on the nose. I don't have a lot of complaints about it. I really like this list. I mean, I wish I had something that was a little more top-ended here, but I don't. But because the overall speed is really good and there's a lot of units that are moving quick with jump and this and that, I've had a lot of success with this capture the flag list as well. Bunkers. This is probably, it's probably the second weakest list that I have. And because I didn't run any infantry, so there's no just blowing up. There's no blowing up the bunkers with this list, right? It's just not something that's going to happen. It does have a decent number of medium range shots at 19, considering the fact that it is it is this swarm list. And that's because I got the grasshopper, the heavy LRM, and the Atlas in there, right? So again, I've identified this yellow jacket as possibly coming in and swapping out because I'm only at the 246. This list is really going to struggle at bunkers, right? And I'd almost rather try to figure out a way to take advantage of these 4 missing points and then maybe going and getting something that can replace this locust that can transport infantry or do something to get in there to take the bunkers out, because this is really going to have a hard time with it because you're really relying on moving in and blowing up the bunkers, and that heavy LRM and Atlas just aren't going to. They don't have the speed. They're not going to get there, right? So you're really going to struggle with this list in the bunkers mission. The other thing, I kind of hamstrung myself because I really wanted to try to do most, if not all, bug mechs, if possible, and try to do all lights and make it work. And this is just one of those missions where it doesn't. Now, I should also note that for this casual event, Jamie had kind of done his own missions and some tweaks and had pre-announced what missions were going to be played and what the tweaks were to the normal Wolfnet missions. And I knew bunkers wasn't going to be in there. So I didn't consider bunkers when even building this list. But if I was going to try to build or take this list to a different tournament, I'd have to really look at whether or not I'd adjust this list just to play bunkers. And, I already know that here in Capture the Flag, these are the only time that this Stinger and Wasp are being used. And that's 34 points. The honest truth is, and I knew Capture the Flag wasn't going to be running this tournament also, but the honest truth is this Stinger and this Wasp probably can be swapped out for something that would better perform in Capture the Flag and then give me some flexibility here in bunkers, right? And so those would be things that I would need to consider. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to have to lean less into the bug mech thing. And I really wanted to play into the bug mech thing. But as you can see, as I'm building these lists out, I might have built it for one tournament where I knew what the missions are, but now I don't. When I'm going into another tournament where I don't know what the missions are and the possibility of bunkers coming up, I know where my weak spot is, right? It's in this bunkers list. It's also in King of the Hill, which we'll get into a second. And so I know, and I've identified which units potentially could be dropped and then replaced, right? So we'll move on to King of the Hill. Now, the biggest problem with King of the Hill is its size. This list as a light list, and if you're going to do a swarm list that is built around light mechs, you are not going to have the size to dominate in King of the Hill. It's just not going to happen. The other thing is the Atlas is really slow. It's going to have a hard time getting there. The LRM carrier ain't getting there at all. So what you're really relying on is trying to delete units while your little stuff gets on the objective and seals the deal. Now, again, I knew that King of the Hill was not going to be in this tournament, right? I knew it wasn't going to be there. And so when I built my 350, I knew that I was going to have to worry about it, And so if you're playing in a tournament where you know what the 3 missions are, the 4 missions are, the 5, you can build specifically to those strengths and really get tighter lists in there. So for example, we played a version of Domination. We played a version of, what was it? I think it was stand up. We played a stand up fight, and we basically played like a quadrant control where you had to control quadrants. And this list went, I won 2 games. I tied 1 game, which I ended up being technically a loss because I scored 3 less MOV than my opponent, and then I lost no games. And so that was the quadrant control where we tied, and then in the other games I won. And then in my other games that I've played since then, I've probably won the majority of them in spamming out a lot of these light mechs. So it's had a lot of success. It's been really good, and I've really enjoyed it. I'm going to take another quick break, and then I'm going to come back, and we're going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses, and then some kind of neat modeling stuff that I did for this. All right, so now I want to talk to you guys about what the pros and cons of this list are and a couple of tips to making it successful. So the pros are going to be numbers. Most of your lists are running 8, 9, 10 units. And so you're going to have, you're going to be able to out activate your opponent. You're going to be able to initiative sync your opponent. You're going to be able to swarm. You're going to be able to be in more places than your opponent. Along with that is speed, mobility, and your TMM. It's going to probably be on average better than whatever your opponent's average is going to be. The other thing to remember is that your TMM is also going to be affected by the large number of units that have jump in there. So you're going to be able to get that TMM up even higher. And then the other thing is even though you don't have a lot of shots, they are reliable shots with the number of skill 3 and skill 2s in your list. The cons of this list is low health and low damage output. Those are things you're going to have to really be mindful of. So in the tip section, what you really want to do is be very strategic about how you place terrain. You want to have line of sight blocking terrain that you can hide behind, that you can skirt around. You want to take advantage of that, of buildings, of double hills, things like that, to really maximize, or not maximize, but minimize the number of shots that are coming in towards you, especially towards your light units. And you want to be able to pick your fights and focus your fire, right? You want to isolate units. You want to hammer them and bring them down, and then you want to move on to the next one and move on to the next one and move on to the next one. And what you don't want to be in is a close range brawl with your opponent where they're getting all their shots in on you and they're focus firing and just driving down and bringing all their weapons to bear, right? And knocking out your light mechs one at a time until you don't have any more board control, and all you got left is that Atlas and that LRM carrier, which are barely moving around the board, right? So take advantage of cover, take advantage of terrain, be really mindful of how you're utilizing it, hide when necessary, don't fight when you don't have to, pick your fights, and hit and run, swarm, get around your opponent's flank, distract them, overwhelm them. And while you're doing that, break their spirits, break their soul, crush their armor, crush their structure with that LRM carrier and that Atlas, right? And concentrate. Those 2 units really always need to be shooting at the same unit. The last thing I want to talk to you is just some hobby options. You might have noticed from my pictures, I did a couple of interesting things with my units here. With my pirate list, I like to kind of paint everything like it's been captured from different raids and forces over the years, and then I really weather it down. Some of my mechs have smokestacks coming out of the back. I do that because in my mind, my pirates don't have the ability to work on fusion engines. So when those break, they replace them with ice engines that run off diesel fuel. And so they bellow and belch out a lot of black smoke. The other thing you'll notice is I put on my grasshopper, I put a piece of elemental armor, painted him up like Iago, a little parrot from Aladdin's. Painted him up, put him on there, so it gives him like a little pirate feel. I put some pirate flags on my Atlas. I also swapped the head out of off my Atlas and put like a bucket head on there, like it had been replaced. And then for my skimmer, the friendly tournament, we could use 3D prints. And so I 3D printed just a kind of a sci-fi like hover car, and I used that as my skimmer. And I did that just for fun, just to give the list, give the modeling a little more character. I had thought about putting a scorpion in the list. I have a scorpion that I built that took the head off that atlas and I put it on the scorpion. So it looks like that deformed mutant toy from Toy Story. I really like how that turned out and looked, but like the Yellow Jacket, I just never could find a spot or a role within the list for that scorpion to be in there. So always keep that in mind when you're doing things. Pirates can be a lot of fun. They have a lot of, even though the list is limited for the availability, there's still a lot of options in there. There's a lot of cool modeling things you can do as well. I hope that you enjoyed this kind of list review and you've enjoyed the direction that the channel's been going. The swarm lists, they work. They can be done very effectively. You just have to, know when to fight. You have to know where to place your stuff. You have to know when to strike out, and you have to be really mindful of those things. But you can be successful with it. And then, if you're going to build your swarm list, you don't have to limit yourself like I did to only bug mechs or majority bug mechs. You can reach out there and do some other stuff too. And you probably would have a more rounded list than this is. I just really wanted to try something that was themey with the bugs for that tournament and that event. And I like the list. It did well for me. Like I said, it won 2 games. It more or less tied another game, even though I technically lost. And it's done well since then, and I enjoy playing it. So hope you enjoyed this, and may the blessings of Blake be upon you.